Hi, everybody. Welcome to panel session 3. We're going to go ahead and get started. I will introduce our moderator for this panel, and the moderator is Stephanie Ramirez. Stephanie Ramirez is the Associate State Director of Community for AARP California, and she's also a member of the PSR Advisory Council. So thank you, Stephanie, for moderating, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
My name is Stephanie Ramirez. Thank you, Court, for the introduction. I've been able to join some of the previous presentations, so far it seems like a great conference, and I'm really excited about this panel, again, improving mobility for vulnerable populations, which it's going to focus on addressing mobility and accessibility problems of disadvantaged populations, particularly in 2 topic areas, novel modes for improved mobility and accessibility, as well as land use, accessibility, and mobility. So we have some great presentations with equally incredible presenters. So let's start off with Dr. Sarah McCullough and Sequoia Erasmus. Dr. McCullough is an associate director at the Feminist Research Institute at UC Davis, and Sequoia is a graduate student researcher at UC Davis. So we'll kick it off with both of them, and then we'll transition to the next presenters. Again, similarly like other sessions, if you have any questions, we're going to have Q&A after all of the presenters have gone. And so if you look at your chat box on the 3rd tab, you can include your Q&A questions there. So I'll kick it off to both of you.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie. Stephanie or Sequoia, can I get a thumbs up that you can hear me? Or okay, great. Thank you. Again, as you heard, my name is Sarah Rebolloso McCullough, and I am really happy to be here with you all. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to share a little bit about myself as I think, very briefly, as I think it's relevant to this topic of equity. I do identify as Chicana, 5th generation Mexican American, and I come into this panel as an expert, not necessarily in technology and transportation per se, specifically on transportation equity and justice. My expertise is around how culture and power operate within science, technology, and transportation. And I'll let my co-presenter introduce herself now. Go ahead, Sequoia.
Hi, thank you so much, and I'm very grateful to be here with you all. My name is Sequoia, and I have had the honor and the privilege to work with Dr. McCullough for the last 2 years on this project, and I am a current student with the UC Davis Institute for Transportation Studies, finishing up a dual degree in community development and transportation technology and policy.
Okay, next slide. So you're going to be hearing about this project that we've been working on to really understand how is the transportation sector in California really doing on equity, particularly as it relates to sustainability and active transportation. To do this, we interviewed 30 transportation professionals who also identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And that research methodology is really informed by our grounding frameworks of critical race theory, which suggests that people have unique lived experience based on their experience of marginalization, and also by mobility justice, which takes on a similar framework of justice-oriented mobility that goes a bit beyond traditional transportation, and from feminist science and technology studies, which provides us with a lot of tools to think about how do we integrate these experiences in a rigorous way into research. And so these 30 interviews that we did were coded, and what you're going to see here is just a peek at some of the themes that emerge. Please.
Our interviews, I have, again, distinct privilege of talking to folks that were within transportation policy and planning. They varied in stages of their career, the types of organizations they work for, and their ethnicities. And I think really interestingly, many of our participants were women and non-binary folks. And we had a pretty good sampling of Black and Latinx folks and mixed individuals. And in terms of where they worked, we had several who worked in advocacy, grassroots organization, some kind of in the consultant world, and some in government agencies. And we had most representation from urban centers in California, including around Los Angeles and the Bay Area. And we did not have as much representation as we would have liked from rural areas, although we did have some, but that's an area where we'd like to draw attention to for future studies. Next
slide, please.
So the importance of understanding equity is tantamount to this project. So one of our participants gave us a really great working definition that we'd like to bring here. And they said that equity is having the freedom to define what health and thriving is for you or your family. Equity is being invited to the process or the process coming to you, but also there being a real sense of agency attached to your voice, not performative inclusion. I think equity, really equity in this field, is going to have to mean intentionally removing power from where it is within the transportation field and redistributing it or recreating it collectively. Next slide, please.
So the definition that Sequoia gave, I think, is really foundational for us. Oftentimes what we found is that many agencies or organizations are trying to do equity work without actually having a strong definition for what and direction for what they mean equity means. So in the absence of that, it can get very confusing. And one of the major themes that emerged from the research was this tension between performative equity, which came up in that previous quotation, and a more authentic version of doing equity work. For organizations that don't or really I'd say for any organization, particularly those that maybe don't have a really strong sense and definition of equity, we highly recommend using the resources around you to determine that definition, because it often does depend on context and the histories of inequity. And from our research, we found that organizations have really rich resources in the form of their Black colleagues and their other colleagues who identify as people of color. So now I'm going to give you a quick overview of what were some of the distinctions between performative and authentic equity work, and we'll illustrate with two specific examples. So first off, performative equity work oftentimes will at some point yield to defensiveness, a sense of defending the work they're doing as good as is. And if that's something that you find happening with an organization, it's time to pause. Another example was organizations not looking fully at the history of institutional racism or of the type of racism that already exists. Another example was thinking of equity work only as outreach, or even only as community engagement. It's so much more than that. Something that is quite common also is a retrofit of equity. So equity is not necessarily seen from the forefront or included from the forefront. Projects get going for a little while, and then equity is sort of added in. Equity is often under-resourced. It is often things are called equity, while the organization is not necessarily working with the community most effective. Borrowing from the disability rights movement, people say nothing about us without us. Performative equity often is felt as tokenistic or a checkbox approach. Another example that particularly can arise when people don't have a strong definition or orientation around equity is quote unquote equity washing, where there are these grand vague goals, but no specific follow through. And finally, performative equity often was seen as industry driven or consumer behavior based. And in other words, that equity is seen as equal opportunity to buy or consume or travel in a particular way that has already been decided is the right way to do it. Next slide, please. More authentic version of equity, the word you'll notice here over and over is community. And so if I were to say in a nutshell what describes authentic community, it is long-term, strong relationship and investment within historically disinvested communities and prioritizing those communities. It means increasing their access and shifting the power imbalance, because there is a power imbalance, and that is not happenstance. That was systemically created over time, both within transportation agencies, within the structures of transportation, and within transportation research. So therefore, what is needed? There needs to be a redistribution of power. It's very complex as to what that looks like, and we're not necessarily going to get into that during this talk, but we'd be happy to talk about it afterward. Authentic equity work is driven by the community. That's one example. It increases community agency. Power moves more from the existing structure to the community. It is accountable to the community. In other words, like, the community is the most important stakeholder to which you return to find out, did it go well? It's transparent and honest. There's not an overpromising. There's not keeping things from the community for whatever reason. It also maintains the dignity of community. A great example of this is some participants pointed out how communities were required to sort of display their trauma in order to be eligible for certain resources. That's not a dignified way to treat them. And finally, well-resourced. Next slide.
So a theme that came up in our interview process, thinking through kind of case studies and things that are really evident right now, and ways that we're trying to work through a lot of the issues that are facing us in terms of sustainability and climate goals. And new mobilities is an item that came up over and over again as something. So the new mobilities being kind of these bike share, scooter share, car share, and everything else that's associated with it. But a lot of our interviewees really saw that equity in terms of the implementation of new mobilities programs and policies was an afterthought. So we understand that from what they were saying to us, that it's a lot of times performative, in that it's driven by profit models over actually serving underserved populations. Equity partners are not really requested to be allies or thought partners at the beginning of projects, but are instead brought at the end as consultants to understand whether or not they were doing equity. And an authentic version of the implementation of new mobilities will really bring in advocates from the beginning. And again, not just to ask, are we doing equity correctly, but perhaps they can help design the model of the new mobilities. A lot of us are trained engineers, planners, and very able to participate as project partners, and not just needing to come in at the end. So that's something that we really wanted to lift up. We understood too that a flexible rollout of these programs really needs to meet the community's needs and demographic abilities. So that's in financial structures, in opportunities and access. And perhaps most notably, again and again, we heard that our focus really should be on public transit, and kind of really taking at the new mobilities efforts and saying, actually, the most important thing in this community right now is public transit, and we need to fund it and find better opportunities within something that already exists. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Sequoia. I just, that was just something that really resonated, was honestly really exciting and interesting for us to hear, was over and over how public transit was was seen as really core to the success of New Mobility's equity work. So I just wanted to reinforce that point. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit about another example, which is recruitment versus retention. Now, a performative version of recruitment and retention tends to only focus on recruitment. So an organization may be very focused on diversifying their workforce through the hiring processes. There's still a lot to say about the challenges of the hiring processes, but that does seem to be an area that many acknowledge that transportation agencies and transportation organizations are improving on. However, what they found was that once individuals who are Black or professionals of color were in the organization, they felt that their voices were devalued, and that the work that they proposed with equity was devalued. They also found that these positions often put them under, quite significant mental and emotional stressors. We should add that we were doing this research we started this research project at virtually the same time as the pandemic began, and we continued doing the research as we saw many uprisings against the murder of George Floyd and many other examples of state-sanctioned violence. And so this was also a time period when those doing equity work and who are part of Black communities and communities of color were experiencing quite a high level of stress, and that this was often ignored in the workplace. What they said that they wanted was they wanted to see changes within the culture of their workplace to have better retention. So don't just hire us in, but actually work hard to keep us there, make us want to stay. And what would that look like? It would mean giving Black professionals, professionals of color, and equity professionals more decision-making power, listening and responding to their voices, fostering and allowing like BPOC or Black professional of color centric spaces. Again, I can't overemphasize how often this came up. And we're talking about in the workplace, but I think we can expand this recommendation to think of any community that we may be a part of, whether it's a research community or a practitioner community or any sort of community of practice. Next slide. Okay, so our final recommendations. Again, I can't go over those in depth due to time. Happy to talk about them more later, but the one huge one is to know the histories of disinvested communities, both broadly speaking in terms of this nation and the state, but also in the very specific location where one may be working. Maintain an ongoing relationship with historically disinvested communities that isn't necessarily just around one project. That may be where it starts, but it must continue beyond that project. To integrate community and equity experts into projects early on, not necessarily once things are already moving. This one is paramount, to show humility. This is an area where many professionals do not have expertise, and it is important to embrace that and understand yourself as a learner. And as part of that, recognize the expertise of those that are historically marginalized, people that are not traditionally given that respect within our culture. And therefore, that also means giving communities more power in decision-making processes and increasing the budgets for equity-related work. Next slide. So with that, we thank you, and we look forward to your questions in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you both. Definitely a lot, I think, to process, and I think a great initial presentation to really put a foundation to the rest of the presentation. So again, if you have questions and answers, make sure to include it in the tab. in the chat box, you'll see the third tab being Q&A. So make sure that you put your questions there. Our next presenter is Madeline Brozen. She's the Deputy Director at the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. And she's going to be giving a presentation on traffic collisions and looking at data trends here in Los Angeles County. Go ahead, Madeline.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for everyone for attending and to PSR for hosting and for the support of this work. So what I'm going to walk through today is a piece of a larger project that we're wrapping up, but really kind of focusing on who is at risk in terms of traffic collision victims in LA County. Next slide, please. So we have a large body of work on traffic safety that's really focused on the various physical conditions and land use characteristics that relate to where collisions happen. And there's a pretty clear message, I think, in all of that work that especially as you look to street conditions that relate to traffic fatalities or serious injuries, that speed plays a huge role in that, and street design that facilitates the fast movement of vehicles does that as well. So for this project, wanted to kind of get away from looking at some of the geography parts. I will kind of bring in one more of it, but just to understand a little bit who's affected in terms of traffic fatalities and injuries, in terms of age, race, the modes they're using, and geography. The geography that we're looking at is the disadvantaged communities with the California 535 definition I'll get back to in a moment. The data that we used for this analysis was looking at a 5-year period, so from 2013 to 2017, for all traffic collisions within Los Angeles County. These data come from the Transportation Injury Mapping System at UC Berkeley SafeTrack. The data include a variety of different files that relate to where the collision happened, the characteristics of who was involved, and the characteristics of victims that were injured or killed. One thing that this project highlights is the incompleteness of these data. I'll get back to some specific parts of this, but we're really limited in what we can say about who is affected by race ethnicity because the data themselves are woefully incomplete in terms of the officer at the scene filling out the race or ethnicity information for each victim. Next slide, please. So this project really set out to look at this 5-year period as a whole because the individual years can be quite noisy. But I think it's still important to understand the context of what's been happening because these 5 years and the recent trends in traffic collisions have not been stable. And what we find in LA County is similar bad news to what's happening across the United States, that our streets are getting more dangerous and people are dying as a result. So between 2013 and 2017, you saw a 14% increase in the number of collisions resulting in injury. Those are the purple lines, are the number of collisions. And we saw a 24% increase in the number of injured victims, which are the orange lines. 21% increases in collisions resulting in a fatality, and a 20% increase in traffic-related deaths. Next slide, please. So overall, these trends are not the same in all groups. What we see is that a couple of things here in this table. So this table looks at, for all of the collisions that happened in this 5-year period, what have been the trends in terms of the victims, the modes the victims were using. So on average, there were 242 fatalities of people walking over this period of time, and it was a 22% increase from 2013 to 2017. You can see that this is not an issue relating just to people walking, that there were 34 fatalities of biking annually, 296 from driving. And we also include statistics related to motorcycling use that we don't really come back to, but it is part of the safety collision puzzle, so to speak. One thing I want to highlight here also is that fatalities have been increasing dramatically among people walking as well as people using motorcycles. But in terms of the scale, we had on average 242 people dying in LA County each year, just walking. And you relate that to 296 average annual deaths by people driving. The amount of miles that those two modes use are wildly different. So we see a real peak concern among people walking. Next slide. So in this chart and the following charts are kind of show you some of the analysis in terms of who the individual characteristics of the victims of these collisions. So what we found is that from 2013 to 2017, Black victims were most overrepresented in both in terms of fatal and injured victims. And they are the only racial or ethnic group of the 5 that are shown here that had this overrepresentation. While I'm not showing it here, Black victims are overrepresented in every single mode of transportation. This chart is limited to only the collisions where the race or ethnicity information for the victim is included. And 23% of fatal victims and 39% of injured victims do not include information relating to the victim's race. So this is a non-insignificant loss of data, but is very telling nonetheless in terms of what is happening by race and ethnicity. Next slide. So then as we look both at race and ethnicity and in mode, the one thing kind of the earlier slide highlighted is just how much of a concern this is with people walking. So of all of the fatal victims in this time period, 39% of fatalities were among people walking. And then it's even more peaked among both the Black and Latino communities. 1 in 4 traffic deaths in 5 years in all of LA County was either a Black or Latino pedestrian. This is not a crisis that affects all communities equally, and we really see that how much is among the most vulnerable people that are walking. Next slide. So then we also looked a little bit at age. So the age categories are what you're seeing here. Youth is from 0 to 17, adults are 18 to 64, and older adults are 65 years old or older. And in general, there are fewer disparities by age, but older adults are overrepresented in terms of fatalities. They represent 17% of fatal victims and 12.5% of the LA County population. But again, what we see is that it's a combination of individual vulnerability and also the modes. So of all of the older adults that die as a result of traffic collisions, 55% of those were walking at the time when they were killed. Next slide. So the last thing, one of the last things I'm going to show here is as it relates to disadvantaged communities. I will say that disadvantaged communities is not a term I think that people living in those communities identify with. And it might make more sense to use a term like environmental justice communities. But to kind of speak to the definition that California uses, especially as it relates to how state transportation dollars and climate dollars are allocated. So a disadvantaged community is one that ranks at the 85th percent, I believe, or higher in the state's CalEnviro screen. And so what you can see here is that in terms of the population between the disadvantaged and advantaged communities, the fatalities and injuries among victims are pretty in line. But the disadvantaged communities represent a very small area, so only 11% of the land area of LA County, but 44% of the collisions that resulted in fatalities happened in these areas. And then we also see that there is a greater number of fatal pedestrian victims within disadvantaged versus advantaged communities. Next slide. So to summarize, very sadly, these data and findings are not new. They are not necessarily unique to LA County. But I think it's really important to keep in mind just how severe the consequences of an unsafe transportation system lead to. So traffic collisions in LA County result in hundreds of unintentional deaths each year. These deaths are disproportionately experienced by Black and Latino people while walking, older adults while walking, and people walking in disadvantaged communities. So in terms of some of the recommendations from this work, the first one is to really prioritize large-scale investments in communities of color where this issue is, where people are most at risk. It is really great to see that there's Vision Zero in many communities across LA, but I think that what we can see is that the scale of this investment is not matching the current problem that's going on. Building on Sarah and Sequoia's presentation, I just want to highlight how the response to these issues can really also dovetail with some of the kind of larger issues relating to transportation equity, and that these capital investments that need to happen to make these streets safer should need to go hand in hand with engagement strategies that center Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because they are the victims in this. And I would be remiss today to not end this presentation with also a call to really think about the role of traffic and of armed police officers. And I do not think that there's any more reason to be continuing to try to make our streets safer with using armed law enforcement when we know that the consequences can be so deadly, like we saw this weekend in Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center. So I want to thank everyone for attending and look forward to any of your questions.
Thank you, Madeline, for your presentation and for saying his name. I know that that has been heavy on a lot of people's mind. It's something that my colleagues at AARP took the time to process, to think about, and lots of feelings, a lot of anger, frustration, sadness, numbness. And so wherever you fall within that process, again, it definitely is a call out. I think if you see Dr. McCullough's comment, this is important research and really thinking about how do we make streets safe in an equitable way. And we're not just talking about street design, but that police enforcement and brutality and really the loss of Black human life that keeps happening over and over again. So we're going to transition again. If you have any questions, I do encourage you to put it in the box. The last presentation that we have is Andrew Schouten. He's an assistant professor at I actually put this that I was going to pronounce it. Ritsumeikan University. Yes. So we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for having me and giving me the chance to speak. As you can see today, I'm going to be talking about older adults and driving. But before I start, and I think as many of you know, one of the co-authors of this study, Martin Wax, unfortunately passed away last night. So I'm at a bit of a loss as to what to say right now, but I'm sure a lot of you knew Marty very well and knew what a wonderful person he was. And it's, you know, a huge loss for a lot of people. So we'll miss Marty very much. So I should get started. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think that we're all aware of the hugely important role that driving plays in the lives of most Americans, and the fact that driving or being driven is overwhelmingly the way that most people in the US get from place to place. Over 88% of adults have driver's license, 82% of all trips are taken in a private vehicle. And I think that we also know, or at least it's not surprising, that this is the same for older adults, right? 82% of people 65 and older have a driver's license, and people over 65 take an even higher percentage of their trips by car, 86%. So clearly, older adults, like the rest of Americans, are very much auto-dependent. Next slide, please. But somewhat distinct from younger populations, older adults are far more likely to have to deal with a range of physical and sometimes cognitive limitations that might make driving either difficult or dangerous. Therefore, older individuals face a lot more questions about if and when they should limit their driving or whether to stop driving altogether. And there's been a lot of research done on these decisions, and a lot of determinants of driving cessation have been identified. And for the most part, they are kind of what you might expect, right? Age is extremely important, and as are health-related issues and vision, of course, and several others. But one factor that hasn't really received a lot of attention is the role of one's built environment, right? There's a mountain of research on how the built environment affects travel behavior in general, but it's not really clear how the built environment affects the travel behavior of older adults, but more specifically how it affects older adults' decisions about limiting or stopping driving. Next slide, please. And to look at this more deeply, we had two primary questions that we wanted to address. The first is there any relationship between the built environment of where an older adult lives and the likelihood that he or she would stop driving or limit their driving, right? So the idea being that perhaps people living in areas that are less car-centric, where destinations are walkable or where perhaps public transit might be somewhat of an option, it's possible that older adults living in these areas might, all else equal, be more likely to give up driving or limit driving than people in areas where car travel is more essential to destination access. And then second, we wanted to know about relocations and associations between these changes in location and decisions about driving behavior, right? So the idea being that an older person maybe is starting to feel like driving is difficult or a burden or potentially dangerous. So he or she might make the decision to move into an area where it's easier to get around without a car. This is maybe an intuitive thought to some degree, and we wanted to see if this actually happened, if older adults who made moves to walkable or transit-rich neighborhoods, if they were more likely to give up driving, all else equal, than those who stayed in more car-centric communities. Next slide, please. So our data for this analysis was the Health and Retirement Survey, which is a panel survey of about 20,000 older adults from across the US. The survey has collected data every other year since 1992. And as you can tell from the title of the survey, there's a heavy focus on issues of health and labor force participation, but also there's a lot of other data on things like demographics and wealth and activity participation. And fortunately for our purposes, there are a few questions about driving. So we used respondents' answers to two questions about driving. The first is simply, can you drive? And the second is, for those who can drive, do you limit your driving in some way? For example, do you only drive during the daytime? Do you avoid taking long trips? Do you only drive in areas around your home? So our outcome measures were, or our outcome variables were measures of whether these indicators changed between two waves. was there a change in the individual's driving status, either from being able to drive to being a non-driver, or from being a non-restricted driver to someone who limits their driving behavior. And then we controlled for a number of factors that the literature suggests, as I was talking about before, are determinants of stopping and limiting driving, particularly age, health factors, vision, sex, race, several other characteristics. Next slide, please. And then our key indicator was an individual's residential location. So we looked at the behavior of individuals in 3 types of neighborhoods to see if their patterns of stopping or limiting driving differed from others. First, those living in census tracts with very high population densities, those living in tracts with very high levels of job access via transit, and then those living in tracts that are identified as old urban neighborhoods. This is a category that's based on a typology that was developed by a research team at UCLA. And I would love to go into the details about how the typology was created, but in the interest of time, I'll just have to summarize by saying that these old urban neighborhoods represent the densest, most walkable, transit-rich neighborhoods in the US. So the idea is, with all 3 of these indicators, we're looking at changes in behavior of people who are living in the places where, at least presumably, it's easiest not to drive. So the assumption is, if you're going to give up driving or limit your driving and depend on modes other than your private vehicle, these are the types of neighborhoods where that would be most feasible. And we looked at 2 populations, the full sample, and then we also looked at movers only, so we could assess how the role of changing locations is related to changes in driving behavior. Next slide, please. Okay, so what did we find? I won't touch on all the control variables in the models, but I will say that they were very much in line with other studies. In terms of our main focus, the relationship between driving cessation and neighborhood characteristics, there was a pretty clear association between living in a dense, transit-rich environment and having a higher likelihood of stopping driving. So all else equal, people living in high-density neighborhoods were 48% more likely to stop driving. Those in high transit access neighborhoods were 70% more likely to stop. And those in old urban neighborhoods were 40% more likely to stop driving than people living in other neighborhood types. So for limiting driving, there was not a statistically significant difference between living in one of these dense transit-rich environments and limiting driving. So just to kind of put it succinctly, all else equal, adults in dense transit-rich urban areas were more likely to stop driving than those in more car-centric communities. Next slide, please. The results of the movers-only model were somewhat more surprising, I guess. Generally speaking, there was not much of an association between moving into one of these dense transit-rich neighborhoods and changing in driving behavior. Movers into high job access tracts did show an increase in their propensity to stop driving, but moves into the other neighborhood types, the high density neighborhoods and the old urban neighborhoods, these moves were not associated with higher rates of driving cessation. And furthermore, with regard to driving limitation, there was also no association with moves into any of these neighborhoods and an increased likelihood of limiting driving. So to summarize things for movers, it's rather rare for older adults to move away from car-centric neighborhoods and into dense transit-rich urban areas. Only like 1 or 2% of the sample made this type of move. And when they did, they didn't show a pronounced propensity to stop or limit driving. Next slide, please. So why is this important, or what does it mean for planning or policy? I think it's clear that there is an association between denser transit-rich neighborhoods and higher rates of giving up driving among older people. But I think as much as some of us, maybe would like to go out and build a bunch of really high density transit-rich neighborhoods, first of all, it's probably not going to happen. But second, it's hard to know how much this would really help the mobility and accessibility of older adults. There's almost certainly some degree of self-selection in our results, meaning that of the people who live in these very urban areas, a lot of these people are potentially less dedicated drivers to begin with. So they potentially prefer other types of travel. They have a lower baseline level of attachment to vehicle travel, and thus they are predisposed to giving up driving regardless of the neighborhood type that they might be living in. Additionally, there's just not a lot of relocation of older adults into these dense urban neighborhoods. There's some evidence that people say that they are interested in making these kind of moves, that potentially doing this, moving into an urban area when they get older, to limit their, or to kind of reduce their dependency on cars. But in reality, very few people make this kind of move later in life. And when they do, they aren't particularly prone to giving up driving. Most adults age in place, most older adults age in place. And for a lot of older adults, driving, as I said at the beginning, driving is familiar. In many cases, driving is easier. It's less of a physical burden than other types of travel. And as Maddie talked about, obviously, walking can be very dangerous for older people. So I think that any type of policy that's aimed at improving older adults' mobility and their access to destinations has to keep these facts in mind. Yes, of course, for those who want to take advantage of urban amenities, we need to provide enough of these types of neighborhoods, enough housing in these types of neighborhoods for older adults. But we also can't try to impose this framework on older adults. We need to find ways to either support safe driving among this population, but also alternative transportation services that are comfortable and that are suitable to the types of communities that the vast majority of the age population lives in. Okay, next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here and for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And again, I know that some folks have expressed, deepest condolences for Professor Wax, and for those that knew him. I know, Maddie, you worked with him really closely at UCLA, and for others who are also participating on today's call. I will say that, Andrew, your research really hits close to home for my day job at AARP. We actually, look a lot at driving patterns, particularly for AARP members. So I know that our Public Policy Institute puts out a driving report every year to look at trends, again, within our membership, that we do a lot of surveys with our members, and particularly thinking about, when driving privileges are revoked and how detrimental that can be for older adults, that, driving is their main source of transportation, but also thinking about, the presentations that Dr. McCullough and Sequoia, as well as Madeline, gave, where, you have a lot of older adults that have never driven to begin with. And so what happens when they do live in these rich, these rich transportation, high density places, and because of housing, because of economic housing supplies, they're actually pushed out of their neighborhoods and go to places where, these neighborhoods don't reflect that public transit richness. And so they're kind of left into this void to figure out. And then a lot of the times we go into these dangerous places where, infrastructure isn't made for people to walk, to take public transportation. And most of them actually suffer from isolation, which is a big problem among older adults. And I think that all of us sort of really felt during this pandemic in multiple ways. So I just want to thank you all. I know that I have some questions, but I do want to get to as many as we can from people. You've been participating for the last almost 4 hours. And so if you have any questions that you want to ask the panel, please go ahead. So the first one that I see that actually has a vote. So thank you all for engaging with us. Wondering about the relationship between aging and the need to stop driving and the onset of limitations to other kinds of mobility. So I'm thinking, Andrew, this might be to you, but also welcome others weighing in.
Okay, thank you for the question. And I'm going to assume stopping driving, the onset of limitation to other kinds of mobility. I'm hoping that I'm interpreting this correctly, but I'm guessing that's referring to like trouble walking or trouble accessing transit or trouble just getting around any other way. And as I think I pointed out a little bit at the end of my presentation, right? For a lot of people, driving is the least physically burdensome way to get around, right? I mean, if you've ever gotten on a bus, you realize that you have all the curbs to deal with, you have lots of steps, you have bus drivers driving, not waiting for you to sit down or something like that. You have a long walk, a long wait, and then as Maddie talked about, simply walking to destinations can be very dangerous for older adults. So yeah, I think that there is some idea that, people are going to stop driving, they're having trouble driving, so we need to build communities where older people can use transit or older people can walk to things. And I think that's partly true, but I think that's a dangerous assumption because for a lot of people, driving is the easiest way to get around. So yeah, in terms of alternative transit options, I think it has to be flexible. I think there has to be the opportunity for people to live in the dense urban environments and not be pushed out of them and have a home in these places if that's where they want to live and that's what they're used to, but also kind of flexible transportation options where older adults who maybe they have to stop driving, but they also can't walk, they can't take transit, that's the only way they can get around, services that support this kind of mobility as well.
Yes, sir, do you want to jump in?
It's actually, I might, I want to add really briefly, I appreciate this question, and it brings up some, we did have at least one person in our study that talked specifically about the lack of attention to disability in transportation conversations. And this question really reminds me of that there's so much rich, thoughtful work within the disability movement. And so I think there's a really strong possibility for more connections there. I also think of like social conditions that limit older people's mobility. One would be fear in some communities of detainment by ICE. Another one that I think of is the current rise in violence against Asian Americans, specifically older Asian Americans. And so, I think age is just one of many intersections that I think we need to be thinking about in these conversations.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that is I think we can be kind of a little more holistic when we think about like just because Andy's 100% right, driving is the easiest, but I'm not sure it's driving. It's the car that's actually the easiest, right? It's not that these people need to drive themselves. So actually some work that I was very fortunate to do with Professor Wax looked at older adults in Westlake, really among people who had never driven. And when they had a family support, like that could drive them somewhere, like that was really kind of the easiest way for them to get around. So I think that pretty much no one used ride hailing, because especially we need to be considerate that the most vulnerable older adults are very low income and live on very fixed incomes. So thinking about ways that we can give people access to other people driving them that are easy, and kind of just thinking about the role of volunteer driver programs and just like a lot of other ways to use kind of, I think Sarah's totally right. There's a lot about this in the disability community, just about the role of other people and people that you trust that can help to overcome transportation burdens.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, for saying that, because as soon as it was brought up, I work with a lot of disability advocate here in Los Angeles. And, if you really think about addressing some of the call outs that the disability community has done for many, many years, right, that a lot of different mobility users could benefit from some of the infrastructures. Like one of the first things was sidewalks. Like I feel like what's the biggest burden for a lot of people is broken sidewalks or the existence of no sidewalks. Or not designed for any other than, sort of that ableism perspective and lens that which they're designed in. And I also think, Maddie, you brought up a really good recommendation in terms of caregiving, right? And a lot of folks don't live by themselves, right? That goes back to Sarah and Sequoia's presentation around, bringing in people, not just at the end, but at the beginning of really letting you know what their community looks like, what their experiences look like in order to inform some of these decisions that we're making. We have another question in the chat from Bill. When shall we transition to car-free cities, built as transit-centered loops, topographic chains of urbanization, pearls on a necklace, where personal cars are not allowed? Prepare for sea level rise. I don't know if anybody wants to take that.
2025, I would say.
Tomorrow.
No, I mean, I think, it would be wonderful for everybody to have full access to the kind of options, transportation options that they would like, and to not force everybody to drive all the time and impose this kind of environment where we're at an incredible disadvantage if you can't afford a car, you can't drive a car, you don't have access to somebody who has a car. So yeah, obviously it's difficult to say, but I mean, it would be nice if every policy kept in mind that we're living in an incredibly overwhelmingly, or not, I guess I'm not here, but in California and in the United States, auto-centric environment, and that just doesn't suit a lot of people for a lot of reasons. So.
Yeah, I think this vision is one that a lot here may share, and it just, the thing I think of is how incredibly important it is to include those who historically have not been a part of this community who've not been a part of transportation conversations in this vision, because I think about how many communities who historically, out of lack of resources, have actually been very frugal, you could say, in their carbon footprint, are required to have it grow right now because of the expense of the growth and the expense of the housing market. and people being pushed out of many more transit-oriented urban centers into other spaces where more car travel is required. So, it's a really complex picture. And I feel like these equity questions absolutely have to be at the center of how we answer them, because if we don't, the default will be that they will be excluded from this vision, because that's what it has been historically.
Hi, all. Just cutting in for a second. We have gone over, so I just want to give you just a few seconds to wrap it up. Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, great. See, I'm looking at a clock that says ending in 25 minutes. So I'm just like, oh, we have a lot of time, but I guess this is for the day. Okay, great. And I was just getting started, but I want to thank all our panelists. I really want to center the conversation, and I think it began with a great presentation around, and this is sort of what I got down, especially as we're all transportation professionals and advocates around, and maybe this is the last question that I'll pose. Looking at Sarah and Sequoia, I know that one of the recommendations that you gave of, looking at Black and POC colleagues as experience experts, not just on sort of the topics of race or when we're uncomfortable, but really their expertise as transportation experts and professionals. And so where is sort of this like fine line on also sort of sometimes tokenizing our colleagues in this way? So I really want to pose that question. If in your survey you had participants that said, it is a fine line where you're going to the same colleagues to do this emotional labor work, and particularly when they are the most affected by what's happening in not just in our society, but dealing with transportation, but a lot of other issues. I'm thinking of the pandemic and who's been hit the hardest. So, anything that you can sort of add to that particular question.
The immediate thing I think of is, very short answer, is give them power, put them in leadership roles. Because you're right. If all say organization is doing is going to them and asking them to do more, you're right. That's a problem. Can be tokenization, it's extra labor. But if you essentially put them in a place to actually have decision-making power, that dynamic can shift. So that their role isn't necessarily to educate everyone else, but it's actually to take action. So, I mean, there's way more to answer that question. And I also want to note, because I don't think we said this, that we were specific around Black and POC because we did try to recruit Indigenous transportation planners into the study, but we were not successful. And so I just want to note that is not supposed to be an exclusion, but it is acknowledging the limitation of our study. So just to be really explicit about that. Sequoia, would you like to add anything to that?
Maybe just to uplift the work of the untokening, for more information and resources about this from people who have done a lot of work around this, the untokening.org is their website.
Wonderful, thank you. Any last minute words from any of you? Thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, your research, and engaging in the chat. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.